They say that a woman's touch is meant to heal, to comfort, and to protect. We look for monsters in the shadows, never expecting to find them in the kitchen, pouring a third glass of cheap Chardonnay. But sometimes, the most dangerous predator is the one who claims to love you most, the one who hides a jagged edge behind a mask of domestic exhaustion. In the humid stillness of Winter Park, Florida, a simple game of hide-and-seek didn't end with a playful "found you." It ended with the cold, rhythmic pull of a zipper and a silence that would last forever. Sarah Boone didn't just kill the man she called her partner. She documented his final gasping breaths on her cell phone, convinced in her twisted heart that his slow suffocation was nothing more than a well-deserved lesson. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the woman who would eventually record a man's slow death with a smirk in her voice, one must first look at the sun-drenched, unremarkable streets of Florida, where the line between a quiet life and a desperate one often thins under the weight of humidity and isolation. Sarah Boone was not born a monster. To those who crossed her path in the earlier years of her life, she was simply Sarah, a woman who, like so many others, was searching for a sense of belonging in the sprawling suburbs of the Sunshine State. Born in 1977, Sarah grew up in a world that expected her to be the caregiver, the nurturer, the reliable daughter. There were no flashing red lights in her youth, no traumatic headlines that hinted at the darkness to come. She was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Floridian girl who seemed destined for the standard American trajectory: school, a career, perhaps a family of her own. She moved through her early 20s with the kind of anonymity that serves as the perfect camouflage for a burgeoning narcissism. To the outside world, she was fine, but beneath that fine exterior, a volatile mix of entitlement and a deep-seated need for control was beginning to simmer. By the time she reached her 30s, Sarah had settled into the role of a mother. This is where the mask of the ordinary woman was most firmly fixed. She lived in a modest home, dealt with the mundane stresses of parenting, and navigated the complexities of adult life. But the domestic bliss she projected was a fragile glass structure. Those who knew her more intimately began to see the cracks, the way her temper could flare over the smallest perceived slight, the way she used her perceived fragility as a weapon to garner sympathy or to deflect blame. In the eyes of her neighbors in Winter Park, she was just another face in the suburban landscape. They saw a woman who liked to enjoy her drinks, perhaps a bit too much as the years rolled on, but in a state where Florida man and Florida woman stories are the local currency, a little bit of erratic behavior is often overlooked. They didn't see the woman who, behind closed doors, was becoming increasingly obsessed with her own grievances. Sarah didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a martyr. In her mind, she was a woman who did everything for everyone else, and yet was constantly wronged by the world. Her life was a series of temp jobs and shifting priorities. She wasn't a high-powered executive or a career-driven striver. She was someone who existed in the middle. She was the woman you'd pass in the grocery store aisle, perhaps looking a bit tired, perhaps a bit frazzled, but never someone you would suspect of being capable of calculated cruelty. This is the terrifying essence of the deadly woman, the ability to blend into the scenery of everyday life so perfectly that her evolution into a killer happens in plain sight, unnoticed. The transformation wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of empathy, fueled by a growing dependence on alcohol. Wine wasn't just a social lubricant for Sarah, it was the fuel for her internal fire. As the bottles emptied, the poor Sarah narrative grew stronger. She wasn't just a woman in a difficult relationship. She was a victim of a cruel universe. This self-victimization is the hallmark of the narcissistic perpetrator. It allows them to justify almost any action, no matter how heinous, because in their mind, they are simply leveling the playing field. By 2017, Sarah had met Jorge Torres Jr. On the surface, they were just another couple navigating the ups and downs of a long-term relationship. They shared a home in Winter Park, a quiet community just north of Orlando. But the walls of their apartment on Frisco Drive held secrets that the neighbors only heard in muffled shouts and the occasional slamming of a door. The ordinary Sarah was still there for the public. The woman who posted on social media, the woman who went to the store. But inside the home, a toxic dance was beginning. Sarah's childhood dreams of a perfect life had long since evaporated, replaced by a bitter reality she refused to take responsibility for. She began to view her life through a lens of extreme resentment. She wasn't the protagonist of a success story. She was the lead in a tragedy where everyone else was the antagonist. This shift in psychology is crucial. When a woman like Sarah stops seeing her partner as a person and starts seeing them as a symbol of all her failures, the path to violence is paved. She lived in a world of 1,200 square foot apartments and Florida heat, where the mundane can feel suffocating. Sarah wanted more. Not necessarily more money or more fame, but more power. She wanted to be the one who decided how things went. She wanted to be the one who held the keys. For years, she played the part of the supportive, if slightly troubled partner. She wore the floral prints, she kept the house, and she maintained the illusion of a woman who just wanted peace. But the peace Sarah wanted was the peace of total submission. As we look back at the years leading up to that fateful February night in 2020, we don't see a woman descending into madness. We see a woman honing her mask. We see a woman learning how to weaponize her voice, her tears, and her perceived weakness. The ordinary woman was a masterpiece of social engineering, designed to ensure that when the horror finally arrived, no one would believe she was the one holding the camera. The stage was set in Winter Park. The bottle was open. The suitcase was empty, waiting in the corner of the room like an omen. And Sarah Boone, the woman who just wanted to be understood, was about to show the world exactly who she was when the mask finally slipped. The relationship between Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. was not a romance. It was a battlefield of shifting alliances and mutual destruction. Jorge, a man described by those who knew him as generally soft-spoken but plagued by his own demons, became the primary canvas for Sarah's growing resentment. To the outside world, they were a couple that simply hit the bottle too hard, but within the four walls of their Florida apartment, a much more sinister dynamic was taking root. Sarah didn't just want a partner, she wanted a subject, someone she could mold, punish, and eventually dominate. Their history was punctuated by the frequent arrival of blue and red lights. Between 2017 and 2020, the Winter Park police were no strangers to the residents on Frisco Drive. Both Sarah and Jorge had been arrested for domestic violence against one another. In Sarah's mind, however, these weren't signs of a mutually toxic environment. No. In her narrative, she was the long-suffering heroine enduring the annoyance of a man who didn't know his place. She began to view Jorge not as a man she loved, but as a project that refused to be finished. The cracks in Sarah's psyche were filled with a potent mixture of Chardonnay and narcissism. As the alcohol flowed, her inhibitions dissolved, revealing a cold, calculating core. She began to keep a mental tally of every slight, every stupid thing Jorge said, every time he failed to live up to her impossible standards. This is the classic profile of the Black Widow in the making. Not one who kills for a life insurance policy, but one who kills to settle a psychological score. She didn't want him dead for money. She wanted him silenced for her own ego. Motherhood, for Sarah, had become a secondary role to her own drama. Her child was a witness to the escalating tension, a pawn in the power games she played with Jorge. Sarah's motives were not born from a sudden snap or a moment of blinding rage. They were the result of a slow, deliberate crystallization of hatred. She felt she was being cheated out of the life she deserved, and Jorge was the physical manifestation of that failure. If she couldn't have the life she wanted, she would at least have the satisfaction of being the one in control. In the months leading up to February 2020, the atmosphere in the home shifted from domestic warmth to an icy, predatory stillness. Sarah's aggression was no longer just verbal, it was becoming experimental. She was testing the boundaries of what she could get away with. She would belittle him, then film him in his moments of weakness, a digital collection of his humiliations that she kept like trophies on her phone. She was building a case against him, not for a court of law, but to justify the lesson she was preparing to teach him. The motive was deceptively simple. Sarah was bored, she was angry, and she felt superior. She viewed Jorge's dependence on her as a weakness to be exploited. In her twisted logic, putting him in that suitcase wasn't an act of murder. It was a fair response to his perceived transgressions. She wanted him to feel the weight of her power. She wanted him to understand, once and for all, that she was the director of this tragedy. The plan wasn't born in a dark alley. It was born in the glow of a television screen and the bottom of a wine glass. It was a game. That's how she would later describe it. But games imply a level playing field, and Sarah had ensured that the rules were entirely in her favor. She had spent years perfecting the role of the victimized woman, knowing that if she ever went too far, she could simply cry and point to her bruises, both real and imagined. She began to see Jorge's presence as an obstacle to her own peace. He was the noise in her head, the reminder of her mediocre life. The motive was the ultimate expression of narcissistic rage, the belief that another human being's life is a disposable price to pay for one's own emotional catharsis. Sarah didn't just want Jorge gone, she wanted him to know it was her who took him out. She wanted to watch the realization dawn on him. She was no longer just a wife or a girlfriend. She had ascended to the role of judge, jury, and executioner. As the sun set on February 23, 2020, the cracks had become a chasm. The domestic mask was still there, but it was brittle. Sarah had convinced herself that she was the one being persecuted, and that tonight, the roles would be reversed. She didn't need a gun, and she didn't need a knife. She had something much more personal: a large, blue, hard-shell suitcase, and a heart that had long since turned to ice. The motive was set, the victim was unsuspecting, and Sarah Boone was ready to play. The air in the Winter Park apartment was thick with the smell of cheap wine and the heavy, humid silence of a Florida night. It was February 23, 2020. To Jorge Torres Jr., it seemed like any other evening of blurred edges and hazy laughter. They had been drinking. Chardonnay for her, something stronger for him. They were celebrating, or so she said. They decided to play a game, hide and seek, a childhood pastime twisted into something macabre. Sarah suggested the suitcase, a large blue designer knockoff sitting in the middle of the floor like an open grave. "Get in," she likely urged, her voice a mix of playful flirtation and a jagged underlying command. And Jorge, perhaps wanting to please her, perhaps too intoxicated to see the predatory gleam in her eyes, complied. He climbed into the dark nylon void. He curled his 5'2" frame into a fetal position, trusting the woman who stood over him. Then, the sound, the sharp, mechanical zip, a jagged metallic scream that sliced through the quiet of the room. Sarah didn't just close it, she locked it. What followed was not a game. It was a descent into a singular, claustrophobic hell. At 11:12 p.m., Sarah pulled out her phone. She didn't call for help. She didn't realize the joke had gone too far. She pressed record. The video shows the suitcase lying on its side. It's bulging, twitching with the frantic movements of a man who suddenly realizes the air is running out. Sarah, I can't breathe, babe." Jorge's voice comes from the fabric, muffled, panicked, stripped of all dignity. Sarah's response is chillingly calm, punctuated by a small, cruel laugh. "Yeah, that's what you do when you choke me," she retorts. She isn't a panicked girlfriend. She is a school teacher delivering a lecture to a dying student. You should probably shut up. She walks around the suitcase, the camera steady in her hand, capturing her own shadow as it dances over Jorge's tomb. He kicks. The suitcase rolls slightly. "Sarah, I can't breathe." He gasps again, the sound of a man drowning in dry land. "That's on you," she sneers. "Oh, that's what I feel like when you cheat on me." She begins to mock him, her voice rising in a sing-song taunt. "Phew, stupid!" Every time he begs for his life, she throws a grievance back at him like a stone. This is her moment of ultimate clarity. She is finally the one in control. She is the one with the oxygen, and he is the one begging for a crumb of it. Minute after minute passes. The kicking slows, the frantic scratching against the interior lining, a sound like dry leaves in the wind, becomes rhythmic, then desperate, then weak. Sarah is unmoved. At one point, she pokes at the suitcase with her foot or perhaps a finger, watching the blue fabric react to his dying struggles. She is filming a snuff movie where she is the director, the star, and the sole audience member. "Sarah! Sarah!" He cries out one last time, his voice a thin thread of agony. "I can't believe you're doing this," she says, her tone almost bored, as if his dying is a personal inconvenience to her. She records a second video. In this one, Jorge's hand is visible, a pale ghost trying to force its way through a tiny gap in the zipper. She doesn't help him. She doesn't unzip it an inch. She watches as the fingers retreat back into the darkness. Eventually, the movement stops. The game has reached its conclusion. The suitcase sits perfectly still under the harsh living room lights. There is no more gasping, no more pleading, just the hum of the refrigerator and the heavy breathing of a woman who feels she has finally won. Sarah Boone didn't stay up to mourn. She didn't panic and try to perform CPR. With the cold-bloodedness of a true sociopath, she put her phone down, walked to her bedroom, and went to sleep. She left Jorge Torres Jr. zipped inside that blue sarcophagus, his body heat slowly dissipating into the nylon, his lungs finally, mercifully, still. She slept for hours while her partner's body began the transition into a corpse, just a few feet away in the hallway. The lesson was over. The silence was absolute. The sun rose over Winter Park on February 24, 2020, casting a bright, unapologetic light into the apartment on Frisco Drive. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic tang of dried sweat and the lingering scent of spilled wine. Sarah Boone awoke in her bed, emerging from a deep, alcohol-induced slumber. For a moment, it was a normal morning, until the reality of the blue suitcase in the hallway came rushing back. But Sarah didn't scream. She didn't rush to the suitcase with a knife to slash him free in a frantic hope that a spark of life remained. Instead, she began to craft her masterpiece, the role of the grieving partner. At approximately 1 p.m., nearly 14 hours after she had zipped the bag shut, Sarah finally placed a call to 911. Her voice on the recording is a study in calculated distress. It wasn't the guttural, incoherent wail of someone who had just found a loved one dead. It was a performance, a series of breathless gasps and carefully timed whimpers. "My boyfriend is dead," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile, but not enough to lose clarity. She explained the tragedy with a story that seemed designed for a sitcom, not a crime scene. They had been drinking, she said. They were playing. Jorge had willingly climbed into the suitcase. It was a joke, a light-hearted moment between two lovers. She claimed she had gone upstairs to bed, thinking he would just get out and follow her. She fell asleep, she insisted, only to wake up and find him still trapped, his body cold and unresponsive. When the first responders arrived, they found Sarah in a state of performative collapse. She was the picture of the distraught girlfriend, pacing, wringing her hands, and offering a stream of consciousness explanation that no one had asked for yet. She was devastated. She was confused. She played the part of the fragile woman so perfectly that for a brief window of time, the officers on the scene treated the apartment like a tragic accident site rather than a murder scene. Jorge's body was removed from the suitcase. The physical evidence of his struggle was harrowing. His fingernails were broken. His skin was bruised from his frantic attempts to push against the hard shell of his nylon prison. But Sarah stood by, her eyes wide with manufactured shock. She leaned into the officers, her body language screaming for comfort. She was the victim here, she implied. She was the one who had to live with this horrible accident. However, the detectives from the Orange County Sheriff's Office weren't looking at the script Sarah had written. They were looking at the details. They noticed the way the suitcase was positioned. They noticed that the zipper was not stuck, nor was it broken. Most importantly, they noticed Sarah's demeanor. There was an uncanny sharpness beneath her tears, a tendency to over-explain, to fill every silence with more proof of her innocence. She was too helpful, too eager to guide the narrative. "We were just having fun," she repeated, a phrase that would become her mantra. She spoke about their relationship as if it were a fairy tale momentarily interrupted by a fluke of physics. She portrayed Jorge as the one who suggested the game, painting herself as the passive participant who simply forgot her partner was suffocating in the hall. The first suspicions didn't come from a witness or a forensic lab. They came from the sheer impossibility of her story. A grown man, even a small one, does not simply forget to get out of a suitcase unless he is prevented from doing so. The detectives watched as she wiped away dry eyes and checked her reflection in the windows. The mask of the grieving wife was slipping, revealing the cold, narcissistic entitlement underneath. She expected them to believe her because she was Sarah Boone, a woman whose accidents were never her fault. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting right there on the kitchen counter. Her cell phone. Sarah, in her supreme overconfidence, believed that she was the hero of her own story. She didn't think to delete the videos. Perhaps she even thought they would prove how drunk and playful they were being. She gave the officers permission to search the device, likely thinking her charm would distract them from the digital truth. As the detectives scrolled through her gallery, the grieving wife persona evaporated into the humid Florida air. They didn't find videos of a fun game. They found the recording of a slow, agonizing execution. They heard the laughter she had forgotten to mention. They heard the taunts. They saw the deadly woman, in high definition, mocking a dying man's last breaths. The search efforts were over. The accident was a lie. And as the realization dawned on the investigators, the woman standing in the living room, the one who claimed to love Jorge Torres Jr., began to look less like a mourner and more like a predator who had finally been caught in her own trap. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. And the silence that followed the discovery of those videos was far more chilling than any of Sarah's manufactured screams. The investigation into the death of Jorge Torres Jr. did not require high-tech forensic labs or a manhunt through the Florida Everglades. The evidence was held within a palm-sized device, surrendered by the perpetrator herself. In the interrogation room, the air conditioning hummed, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the Frisco Drive apartment. Detectives sat across from Sarah Boone, watching as she maintained her composure, her voice still pitched in that tone of weary, misunderstood innocence. The exposure began when the lead detective placed his phone on the table. He didn't lead with accusations. He led with her own words. He pressed play. The room was filled with the sound of the blue suitcase rustling. Then, the voice of the man she claimed to love, begging for his life. "I can't breathe." The detectives watched Sarah's face. There was no sudden outburst of grief, no horror at seeing the final moments of her partner. Instead, there was a calculated silence. She watched herself on the screen, watched as she taunted a dying man, and her first instinct wasn't remorse. It was defense. "That's not what it looks like," she stammered, the first real cracks appearing in her polished alibi. It was a lesson. He was always doing things to me. You don't know what I've been through. This was the core of Sarah Boone's undoing, her absolute, unshakable belief that she was the victim. Even when faced with video evidence of her own cruelty, she attempted to justify it. She argued that the videos were taken out of context, a phrase she would repeat like a prayer for the next 4 years. She claimed she didn't realize he was actually dying, despite the fact that his pleas for air were the only audible sounds in the recording besides her own mockery. Her alibi, the unfortunate accident born of a drunken game, crumbled under the weight of her own narcissism. She had been so confident in her ability to manipulate the narrative that she hadn't bothered to hide the murder weapon, the digital record of the crime. She assumed that the police would see her as she saw herself, a woman pushed to the edge by a difficult man, someone whose minor lapse in judgment resulted in a tragedy that was, ultimately, his own fault for getting into the bag. As the investigation deepened, the ordinary woman persona was stripped away to reveal a pattern of domestic volatility. Neighbors spoke of the constant shouting, police records showed the cycle of arrests. But it was Sarah's behavior after the arrest that truly exposed her. While awaiting trial, she didn't fade into the background. She became a nightmare for the Florida legal system. Driven by a sense of intellectual superiority, she went through a revolving door of legal representation. One by one, 8 different attorneys withdrew from her case. She accused them of incompetence, of being in cahoots with the prosecution, and of failing to understand the complexity of her situation. She wrote hundreds of pages of letters to the judge, filled with flowery language and legal jargon she clearly didn't understand, all in an attempt to delay the inevitable. She wasn't just fighting a murder charge. She was fighting to remain the center of attention. The prosecution built a case that was airtight, centered on those 2 haunting videos. They didn't need to prove she intended to kill him from the moment they started drinking. They only had to prove that she intentionally kept him in that suitcase while he begged for his life. The deadly woman had provided the state with a minute-by-minute confession. Her overconfidence was her greatest mistake. She believed she could outsmart the detectives, the judge, and eventually a jury of her peers. She viewed the courtroom not as a place of justice, but as a stage. But as the months turned into years, the world began to see Sarah Boone for what she was, a woman who had used a suitcase as a cage and a cell phone as a weapon. The investigation was over, the exposure was total, and the Black Widow of Winter Park was finally out of places to hide. The courtroom in Orange County, Florida, became the final theater for Sarah Boone's long-running performance. By October 2024, the Suitcase Murder had become a global sensation, not just because of the horror of the crime, but because of the woman standing at the center of it. For over 4 years, Sarah had manipulated the gears of justice, firing lawyer after lawyer, 8 in total, complaining that no one could properly represent her brilliance. When she finally stood before Judge Michael Cranick, the world saw a woman who hadn't been humbled by years in a cell, but one who had fermented in her own narcissism. The prosecution's case was a surgical strike. They didn't need long-winded theories. They had the digital ghost of Jorge Torres Jr. The courtroom went pitch black as the videos were projected onto a massive screen. The jury sat in a silence so heavy it felt physical, listening to the rhythmic, desperate thuds against the interior of the blue suitcase. They heard Jorge's fading voice. "I can't breathe, Sarah." And then they heard her. The laughter, the casual conversational tone as she mocked his slow suffocation. Sarah sat at the defense table, not with her head bowed in shame, but with the posture of a critic watching a film she found slightly flawed. She scribbled notes. She whispered to her 9th attorney. When it was finally her turn to take the stand, a move many legal experts deemed suicidal, she did so with an air of practiced victimhood. For hours, Sarah attempted to rewrite history. She didn't deny the suitcase. She didn't deny the recording. Instead, she introduced a new defense: battered spouse syndrome. She claimed that the years of abuse she suffered at Jorge's hands had put her in a state of self-defense. In Sarah's reality, zipping a man into a suitcase and watching him die wasn't murder. It was a preemptive strike. "I wanted him to understand," she told the court, her voice steady, devoid of the tremors one would expect from a woman discussing the death of a partner. She spoke about Jorge as if he were an object that had malfunctioned, a nuisance she had finally found a way to fix. She tried to use her vocabulary, words like intentionality and perspective, to create a fog of intellectualism around a brutal act of cruelty. She wasn't a killer, she argued. She was a woman who had simply gone to sleep and forgotten a detail. But the prosecutor, William J., was relentless. He didn't let her hide behind her flowery language. He played the videos again. He forced her to listen to Jorge's terror. "Does that sound like a woman who is afraid for her life?" he asked, the volume of Jorge's gasps filling the room. Sarah's mask finally began to crack, but not into remorse, into indignation. She was annoyed that the court wasn't seeing the truth as she saw it. She was the one who had suffered the most, she insisted. The fact that Jorge was dead was almost an afterthought to her own inconvenience. The jury took less than 90 minutes to reach a verdict. In the world of complex criminal trials, 90 minutes is an eternity of certainty. Guilty, second-degree murder. Sarah's reaction was a chilling display of her psychological makeup. There were no tears for Jorge. There was only a cold, hard stare directed at the jury, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She had failed to charm them. She had failed to outsmart the system. In December 2024, Sarah Boone returned to the courtroom for the final act: sentencing. Under Florida law, the judge had the discretion to give her a term of years or the ultimate price for her game. Judge Cranick did not mince words. He spoke of the extraordinary cruelty and the chilling lack of empathy documented by her own hand. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led her away, the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed like the final zip of that blue suitcase. Sarah Boone, the woman who thought she could control every narrative, was finally silenced by the very law she tried to manipulate. The deadly hide-and-seek had ended, and the woman who loved to watch her victims struggle was now destined to spend the rest of her life in a cage of her own making, a concrete box far more permanent than the one she had chosen for Jorge. The case of Sarah Boone remains a harrowing reminder that the most terrifying monsters don't always wear a snarl. Sometimes they wear a smirk and carry a glass of wine. In the end, the blue suitcase wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a mirror, reflecting the absolute void of a woman who mistook cruelty for power and silence for victory. Sarah believed she was teaching a lesson, but the world learned a much darker one: that a woman's touch can be as cold as a metallic zipper, and that some masks of domesticity are never meant to be removed. Jorge Torres Jr. lost his life in a few square feet of nylon, while Sarah lost her soul in the minutes she spent recording his struggle. Today, she sits in a Florida prison, a place where the walls are thick and the doors are always locked. There are no games there, and there is no one left to manipulate. She is finally exactly where she put Jorge, in a space where no matter how loud she screams, no one is coming to let her out. It's the ultimate irony of her narcissistic design. The woman who wanted the final word is now left with nothing but the echoes of her own taunts, playing on a loop in the silence of her cell. We like to think we know the people we love, but as Sarah Boone proved, sometimes the person smiling across the dinner table is just waiting for the right moment to see if you'll fit inside the box they've built for you. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.